In the quiet corridors of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where history whispers through glass cases and carefully preserved artifacts, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had spent more than 15 years examining photographs from the American Civil War. The autumn of 2014 brought with it a discovery that would challenge everything she thought she knew about historical documentation and human perception. Rain tapped gently against the tall windows of her research office as Sarah adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer to the computer screen. Before her was a daguerreotype from 1864 recently donated by the estate of a Virginia family. The photograph depicted a young Union soldier, perhaps 22, standing beside a military tent. His uniform was crisp, his posture proud, and his eyes held that distant, almost haunted look so common in Civil War portraits. Men staring into a future they could not foresee. But before we continue with Sarah's remarkable discovery, take a moment to ponder. Where in the world are you watching this story unfold? We love connecting with viewers from all corners of the globe. And if mysteries that blur the line between history and the impossible intrigue, you don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Many eerie stories await. Sarah had catalogued thousands of such images, yet something about this particular photograph gnawed at her. She called her research assistant, Marcus Thompson, a graduate student from Georgetown University, whose enthusiasm for historical mysteries matched her own meticulous nature. Marcus, come take a look at this. Sarah called across the archive room, her voice carrying a note of curiosity that made him abandon his stack of documents. Immediately, Marcus approached, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. At 26, he had an almost photographic memory for historical details, a skill invaluable in their research. He pulled a chair beside Sarah's desk, leather creaking softly as he settled in. "What do you see?" Sarah asked, pointing at the daguerreotype on her monitor. Marcus studied the image carefully, his dark eyes scanning every detail. A standard Union soldier portrait from 1864, likely taken somewhere in Virginia, judging by the tent style and the terrain. Infantry regiment, probably. But then he paused, leaning closer. Wait, there's something unusual about his equipment. Sarah nodded slowly. Exactly. Look at his belt. Despite being more than 150 years old, the photograph was remarkably clear. The soldier's leather belt was visible, and hanging from it was what appeared to be a standard military canteen. But as Marcus examined it more closely, his expression shifted from casual interest to genuine puzzlement. That canteen design, he murmured, barely above a whisper. I've never seen anything like it in Civil War documentation. Sarah pulled a thick reference book from her desk drawer. Military Equipment of the American Civil War by Dr. James Henderson, considered the definitive guide to period-accurate military gear. She flipped through pages of detailed illustrations and photographs, stopping at the section on canteens and water containers. Every Union canteen from that period followed specific manufacturing guidelines. Sarah explained, her finger tracing the illustrations. Wooden cork stoppers, canvas straps, distinct metalwork. But look at this soldier's canteen. Marcus squinted at the image, then at the reference materials. The canteen in the photograph appeared to have a screw-on metal cap, a design that would not become standard military issue for decades. Even more puzzling was a small metal loop attached to the side, a feature entirely absent from any Civil War era canteen they had ever encountered. Could it be a photographic error? Marcus suggested, though his tone betrayed disbelief. Maybe a shadow or damage to the original daguerreotype. Sarah shook her head. I've examined the original under magnification. The image is pristine. No damage, no shadows creating illusions. She paused, staring at the screen. Marcus, I think we need to dig deeper. And in the silence of the research room, there was a feeling as if history itself were whispering a mystery from the past, slowly revealing questions that no one could immediately answer. Could we be witnessing a glitch in time, or merely a historical detail the human eye had never noticed before? Imagine standing in that moment where past and present seemed to brush against one another. The drive to Richmond, Virginia, carried Sarah and Marcus through the very heart of Civil War country. Rolling hills and stretches of farmland unfurled on either side of Interstate 95, many of them likely resembling the landscape of 1864. The autumn foliage was at its peak, splashing the scenery with reds and golds, so vivid they seemed almost unreal, as if the past itself had painted them. They were to meet Elizabeth Witmore Thomas's great-great-granddaughter at the family's ancestral home just outside Richmond. The house was a modest Victorian structure, probably built in the 1870s, with a wraparound porch and windows that reflected the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. Elizabeth, a woman in her 70s with white hair and a gracious southern manner, welcomed them warmly. She guided them into a living room filled with antique furniture and family photographs spanning generations. "I'm so pleased you're interested in our family history," she said, settling into a floral patterned armchair. "The photograph has been in our family for as long as anyone can remember. My grandmother always said it was our ancestor Thomas, taken during his service in the war." Sarah and Marcus exchanged a glance, an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Mrs. Witmore," Sarah began cautiously, "we've done some research into Thomas's military service. According to official records, he served with the Confederate Army, not the Union forces." Elizabeth's expression didn't change. Yet, something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps resignation. "Yes," she said quietly. "Thomas served with the 14th Virginia. He was killed at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. Marcus leaned forward gently. "Then how do you explain the photograph? The uniform is clearly Union, and the date on the back indicates it was taken in 1864. Elizabeth was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the arm of her chair. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations of family knowledge. "There are stories," she said. "Family stories passed down through the women in our family. Never written down. Never spoken of outside these walls." She looked at Sarah and Marcus, her eyes holding a mix of fear and relief. "My grandmother told me that Thomas didn't die at Chancellorsville. She said he deserted." The word hung in the room like a confession. Desertion during the Civil War was not just a military crime, it was a shame that could shadow generations. According to the story Elizabeth shared, Thomas became disillusioned with the Confederate cause. He walked away from his unit during the retreat from Chancellorsville and somehow made his way north. The family reported him dead to avoid the shame of desertion. Sarah leaned forward, intrigued and cautious. "And you believe he joined the Union Army? It would explain the uniform," Elizabeth said. "Men changed sides during the war more often than the history books like to admit." She paused, looking toward a window that faced the backyard. There's more to the story. Something my grandmother made me promise never to tell anyone. Marcus set down his coffee cup, the china making a soft clink against the saucer. Mrs. Witmore, we are not here to judge your family or expose any secrets. We're just trying to understand the historical significance of this photograph. Elizabeth studied their faces for a long moment, weighing the burden of a secret against the relief of sharing it. My grandmother said that when Thomas came back, he did return briefly in 1865 after the war ended. He wasn't the same man who had left. In what ways? Sarah asked softly. He talked about things that hadn't happened. Yet, Elizabeth whispered, inventions that wouldn't exist for decades. Battles fought after he supposedly died. And he had that photograph with him. He claimed it was taken during his service with the Union Regiment in Virginia. But he couldn't explain how he came to possess equipment. She gestured helplessly. Equipment that looked wrong somehow. Sarah felt her heart quicken. The canteen, the anachronistic equipment, the impossible timeline. It all seemed to defy reason. What happened to Thomas after he came back? Marcus asked. He stayed for 3 days, Elizabeth said. My great-great-grandmother said he spent most of his time staring at that photograph as if trying to remember something. Then one morning, they found his bed empty. He had left the photograph on the dresser with a note saying he had to go back to where he belonged. Go back where? Marcus asked, but Elizabeth shook her head. No one ever saw him again. A chill lingered in the room as if the past had stretched a hand into the present, leaving questions that would never be fully answered. Where did Thomas go? And what was he trying to remember from that photograph? Or from some future, yet unseen? The family had buried an empty coffin in the family plot and tried to forget the strange episode entirely. Elizabeth looked directly at Sarah. Until you called about the photograph, I was the only living person who knew this story. By the time Sarah and Marcus left the Witmore house, the sun was setting, painting the Virginia countryside in deep purples and fiery oranges. They drove in contemplative silence for several miles, each lost in their own thoughts, grappling with the story they had just heard. Sarah Marcus finally said, breaking the quiet, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. She glanced at him briefly before returning her gaze to the darkening road. What is it? Do you believe in time travel? The question lingered between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. Sarah had built her career on facts documentation and rational analysis. Time travel belonged in science fiction movies, not in serious historical research. 6 months ago, she replied carefully. I would have said absolutely not. But this photograph, Marcus? We've documented multiple historical impossibilities, equipment that shouldn't exist, a timeline that doesn't match official records, family stories that suggest... She paused, searching for words to describe concepts that challenged everything she believed about reality. That suggests Thomas Witmore somehow moved through time. Marcus finished, his voice barely above a whisper. They drove through the gathering darkness, past farmhouses with warm lights glowing in the windows, past fields where morning mist would soon settle. The ordinary world went on around them, yet Sarah felt as though she had stepped through an invisible barrier into a place where the rules she had always trusted no longer applied. Back in Washington, Sarah's apartment overlooked a small park. where late-night joggers followed illuminated paths and streetlights created pools of yellow warmth in the darkness. She stood at her kitchen window, holding a cup of tea long since gone cold, staring at her reflection in the glass. Across the room, a copy of the photograph sat on her kitchen table, seemingly staring back at her. She had studied it dozens of times since their visit to Virginia, and each examination revealed new impossibilities. The soldier's boots appeared to have modern-style lacing. His belt buckle, while generally appropriate to the period, showed wear patterns that didn't match typical Civil War usage. Even his posture seemed anachronistic, as if he carried himself with the confidence of someone from a different era. Her phone rang, startling her from her reverie. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "I hope I didn't wake you," he said when she answered. "I couldn't sleep anyway," Sarah admitted. "I keep thinking about what Mrs. Witmore told us." "I've been doing some additional research," Marcus said. "I wanted to check something before I mentioned it to you, but I think you need to know what I found." Sarah set down her teacup and moved to her living room, settling into her favorite reading chair. "What did you discover?" "I went through Union Army records looking for any Thomas Witmore who enlisted after 1863. I found 3 men with that name, but 2 can be definitively ruled out based on age and physical description." Marcus paused, shuffling papers in the background. "But the 3rd Thomas Witmore is interesting. He enlisted with the 15th Massachusetts Infantry in August 1864, claiming to be from Virginia, but providing no documentation of previous military service." Sarah's pulse quickened. "And the records show what about him?" "He was described as an experienced soldier who seemed to know more about military tactics and equipment than most new recruits. His commanding officer noted an unusual familiarity with Confederate battle strategies." Marcus's voice carried a subtle edge of excitement. "But here's the really strange part," he continued. "He was discharged from service in November 1864 for persistent claims of future military events and possession of non-regulation equipment." "Non-regulation equipment," Sarah whispered almost to herself. "The discharge papers specifically mention a water container of unknown manufacture among his personal effects," Marcus added. Sarah stood and walked to her kitchen table, staring down at the photograph once more. The soldier's eyes seemed to follow her, and the impossible details pressed against the edges of her mind like a whisper from another time. Who was Thomas Witmore truly? And what had he seen or experienced that made him so different from every other soldier in the records? The night outside seemed to hold its breath as if the past itself were waiting for an answer. The young soldier seemed to look back at her across 150 years, his eyes holding secrets that challenged everything Sarah understood about the nature of time and reality. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I think we need to examine this photograph with more advanced technology. I want to know everything: the composition of the paper, the chemical makeup of the photographic emulsion, any trace elements that might tell us more about when and where it was actually created. I can arrange for testing at the Smithsonian's Conservation Lab," Marcus replied. "But Sarah, are you prepared for what we might find?" Sarah looked around her apartment. Her books, research materials, the accumulated evidence of a career built on facts and rational analysis. Through the window, the familiar light of Washington, D.C. glimmered in the distance, the solid, predictable world she had always known. "I don't know," she admitted. But I think we're past the point of turning back. The Smithsonian's Conservation Laboratory occupied an entire floor of the Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland. Dr. James Chen, the lead conservation scientist, had agreed to conduct a comprehensive analysis of the daguerreotype, though Sarah had been careful not to mention the specific anomalies that had prompted their request. The laboratory was a temple to precision-controlled temperature and humidity, specialized lighting and equipment capable of analyzing materials down to the molecular level. Dr. Chen, a meticulous man in his 40s, handled the photograph with the reverence usually reserved for priceless manuscripts. We'll start with non-invasive imaging. Dr. Chen explained placing the daguerreotype under a high-resolution scanner. Multispectral imaging can reveal details invisible to the naked eye, overwritten text, hidden layers, alterations to the original image. Sarah and Marcus watched from behind a glass partition as Dr. Chen worked. The scanning process took nearly an hour, capturing the image at multiple wavelengths of light. When the analysis was complete, Dr. Chen called them into the laboratory. "This is fascinating," he said, pointing to images displayed on multiple monitors. The daguerreotype appears authentic to the 1860s, based on the silver-mercury amalgam composition and copper plate characteristics. He paused, adjusting one of the images. However, there are some unusual elements in the photographic emulsion. The enhanced image revealed details invisible in normal light. Sarah could see individual threads in the soldier's uniform, the texture of his leather equipment, and most remarkably, the mysterious canteen they had studied earlier. The canteen definitely shows manufacturing techniques inconsistent with 1860s metalwork, Dr. Chen continued. But more puzzling is this. He pointed to an area near the soldier's feet. There appears to be something partially buried in the ground, something metallic reflecting light in a way that suggests a smooth machined surface. Marcus leaned closer. "Can you enhance that area?" Dr. Chen manipulated the image, increasing contrast and sharpening the details. Emerging from the shadows was the partial outline of a rectangular object with rounded corners, something that looked disturbingly like a modern electronic device. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered. Dr. Chen nodded gravely. Based on the analysis, this daguerreotype was created in the 1860s using period-appropriate materials and techniques, but it appears to show objects that could not have existed during that time. In 30 years of conservation work, I have never encountered anything like this. The drive back to Washington was quiet and subdued. Both Sarah and Marcus were lost in thought. The scientific analysis had confirmed what they had suspected, but hoped wasn't true. The photograph was genuine to its time period, yet it contained anachronistic elements that defied rational explanation. As they entered the District of Columbia, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Elizabeth Witmore. Dr. Mitchell Elizabeth's voice carried urgency. "I hope you don't mind me calling, but something has happened that I think you need to know." Sarah put the call on speaker so Marcus could hear. "What is it, Mrs. Witmore?" "After you left yesterday, I went up to our attic to look through old family papers. I found a trunk that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother, and inside was a letter Thomas left when he disappeared." Elizabeth's voice trembled slightly. "Dr. Mitchell, this letter, it mentions you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Could you repeat that?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The letter is addressed to the historians who will someday question this photograph. It specifically mentions a Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Smithsonian Institution. Sarah pulled into a parking lot, her hands trembling as she brought the car to a stop. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "Mrs. Witmore, are you certain about what you're reading?" "I've read it 20 times, Elizabeth replied. Thomas wrote that he knew someone would eventually discover the impossibilities in his photograph. When they did, they should know the truth about what happened to him. "What truth?" Marcus whispered. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her words seemed to come from a great distance. He wrote that he had been given a choice to remain in 1865 with his family, living with the knowledge of future events he could never explain, or to return to the moment when his photograph was taken in 1864. He chose to go back. Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Go back? How? He didn't explain that. But he wrote that the photograph was proof that time could bend, that moments could be revisited, and sometimes people could become unstuck from their proper place in history. Elizabeth paused. He also wrote that anyone who discovered this truth would have to decide what to do with such knowledge. A heavy silence settled between them, as if the air itself was waiting for someone to answer the unspoken question. If time can bend, what would you do with such power? The parking lot around them seemed strangely distant in the fading daylight. Other cars, other people all moving through their ordinary routines, unaware that just a few yards away, the fundamental nature of reality was being quietly questioned. "Mrs. Witmore," Sarah said carefully, steadying her voice. "We'd like to see that letter." "I was hoping you would say that," Elizabeth replied. Then her tone changed softer, almost fearful. "There's something else I didn't mention before. The family cemetery. Thomas's grave marker. It has 2 dates of death carved into it, 1863 and 1865. My family always said it was a stonemason's mistake." Sarah turned toward Marcus, and in his eyes, she saw the same mixture of fear and fascination that churned in her own. What had begun as an academic curiosity had now become something else, something that blurred the edges of science and faith reason, and the impossible. "We'll be there tomorrow morning," she said. The next day, the Witmore family cemetery sat silent beneath the gray Virginia sky. A row of iron fencing enclosed the small hill, and ancient oak trees cast long, trembling shadows across weathered gravestones. Elizabeth led the way through the grass, her voice low. "It's this one." Thomas Witmore's headstone stood in the older section. Simple, unadorned granite turned dull with age. Sarah knelt beside it, running her fingers across the engraved letters. It read, "Thomas Witmore, 1841-1863. But beneath it, crudely added in a slightly different hand, was another line, 1841-1865. "The family always said the stonemason made an error," Elizabeth explained quietly. "But the correction? It looks like it was carved much later, doesn't it?" Marcus crouched down, studying the weathered stone. It was. The carving depth, the wear pattern, they're decades apart. Elizabeth reached into her coat pocket and handed Sarah the letter. A single sheet of paper, yellowed with age, but astonishingly well preserved, its ink faded to a fragile sepia. Sarah unfolded it with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "To the historians who will someday question this photograph, and particularly to Dr. Sarah Mitchell of the Smithsonian Institution, The sound of her own name, written in a 150-year-old ink, made Sarah's vision blur for a moment. Marcus gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go on. If you are reading this letter, then you have discovered the truth about my photograph, that it shows things which should not exist in 1864. You have also learned that the records say I died in 1863. Though I write these words in 1865, both are true. I did die at Chancellorsville. I remember the musket ball. I remember falling in the mud, the light fading from my eyes. But I also remember waking up in a place that was not the battlefield and not anywhere I could name. A man in strange clothing showed me the photograph. He told me that some moments in time are like knots in a rope. They pull tight under pressure and trap things that should not be there. My death, he said, had created such a knot. He gave me a choice: I could remain where I was cursed with knowledge of the future I could never change, or return to that moment in the photograph to live it over and over, trapped in that single instant of 1864 until the knot of time finally unwound itself. I chose to go back. Sarah's voice faltered. The graveyard around them had fallen utterly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Mitchell, if you are reading this, then that knot is beginning to unwind. The photograph will change. Details will fade. The impossible elements will disappear. And when that happens, I will be free to die, as I was meant to die in 1863. I leave this record so that someone will know the truth, that time is not the straight line we believe it to be, and that sometimes when tragedy strikes at the wrong moment, reality itself can fracture. Watch the photograph, Dr. Mitchell. When it changes, you will know that a soul has finally found its rest. The letter ended there, signed simply, Thomas Witmore, 1865. Sarah sat back on her heels, the letter trembling in her hands. Above her, the dying light of evening spilled across the graveyard like liquid gold, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she could see a figure standing beside the old oak tree, watching her in silence. The cemetery around them was hushed, save for the gentle rustle of oak leaves in the autumn breeze. In the distance, the ordinary sounds of modern life cars on nearby roads. A dog barking the hum of a lawnmower seemed to belong to another world entirely, as if reality itself had separated into two layers. One mundane, one impossibly strange. Sarah Marcus said quietly, "Look at the photograph." She pulled out her phone and opened the digital copy of the daguerreotype they had been studying for weeks. For a long moment, everything appeared normal. The young soldier, the canvas tent, the mysterious canteen. Then, almost imperceptibly, the image began to shift. It flickered like water disturbed by a single drop. "The canteen," Elizabeth whispered. Sarah leaned closer. The anachronistic metal cap, the detail that had first caught their attention, seemed to blur, fading as though being erased. The strange metal loop, once so pronounced, was disappearing, vanishing like a trace of smoke. "It's changing." Marcus breathed, awe and disbelief tangled in his voice. The photograph? It's actually changing. Together they watched in stunned silence. The impossible elements of the image slowly melted away. The modern-style bootlace transformed into leather ties appropriate for the era. The unusual belt buckle became a standard Confederate clasp, and the rectangular object, partially buried, Near the soldier's feet, a shape that had seemed impossibly modern simply vanished, leaving only Virginia soil and fallen leaves. Most remarkable of all, the soldier's uniform shifted from Union blue to Confederate gray. As the transformation unfolded, Sarah felt as if she were witnessing something sacred, a cosmic error being corrected, a wound in time finally healing. "Look at his eyes," Elizabeth said softly. The distant, confused expression that had seemed out of place for a Civil War portrait was replaced by the steady, determined gaze of a young Confederate soldier, captured at a moment when hope still outweighed the grim reality that awaited him. Within the hour, the transformation was complete. The photograph now showed exactly what it should have shown in 1864. Thomas Witmore, of the 14th Virginia Infantry, standing before his death at Chancellorsville, carrying only the equipment appropriate to his time in service. "It's over," Sarah whispered. "He's finally free." As they walked back toward the house, Sarah's thoughts drifted. They had witnessed proof, astonishing, undeniable proof, that time could be damaged, that reality itself could develop flaws that sometimes took decades to mend. Part of her mind reeled with scientific questions about causality, about the fragile rules that governed history. But another part, the part that had always believed in history as human stories, felt a profound peace. That evening back in Washington, Sarah sat alone in her office at the Smithsonian. Marcus had gone home exhausted by the day's events, but she could not leave. On her screen, the photograph now looked ordinary, like any of the thousands of Civil War portraits stored in the archives. But she knew better. She had witnessed the impossible. She had seen time bend, reality shift, and a soul finally return to its proper place. She opened a new document on her computer, the cursor blinking at her like a heartbeat. The Thomas Witmore daguerreotype, a case study in historical authentication. The report began clinically outlining the investigation, the photograph donated by the Witmore family, the initial historical inconsistencies, the research process, and the scientific analysis. But Sarah paused. She could write a sterile report ignoring the impossible. She could file the photograph note, the family story, and move on. Or she could tell the truth. She thought of Thomas Witmore trapped for 150 years in a single frozen moment, waiting for someone to bear witness to his final release. She thought of history not as a collection of facts and dates, but as a tapestry of human experience, fragile and strange, where the impossible sometimes becomes real. And so she began again. She wrote through the night, the anachronistic equipment, the impossible timeline, Elizabeth's family, stories, the scientific results, and the photograph's miraculous transformation. She wrote about time and memory, about tragedy and redemption, about the thin, trembling edge where history meets something inexplicable. When dawn filtered through the office windows, Sarah leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. She had created a document part, historical report, part witness testimony, part meditation on the mysteries that linger at the edges of human understanding. She would submit the report to the Historical Research Quarterly, knowing it might be rejected by peers unable to accept its implications. She would place a copy in the Smithsonian's archives where future researchers might someday stumble across it and draw their own conclusions. Most importantly, she would remember. She would carry Thomas Witmore's story with her, a reminder that history is more than facts and dates. It is a living record of human experience, where sometimes the impossible becomes real. The photograph now rested safely in the Smithsonian's archives, catalogued as a standard Civil War daguerreotype of no particular significance. Visitors would never see it, and most historians would never know it existed. But Sarah knew. Somewhere in the spaces between heartbeats, in the quiet folds of time, the echo of an impossible moment still lingered, proof that reality, fragile and strange, sometimes bends for reasons we may never fully understand.